But before we get into it, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on those post notifications so that you never miss another video, and live up!
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Live Up. I am here with the incredibly smart, thoughtful, and talented Lakshmi Rengarajan. I'm pretty sure did I say that right, Lakshmi?
You're like 95%.
Oh, okay, I'm gonna try it again. Lakshmi Rengarajan.
Perfect. You got it.
I haven't gotten to know Lakshmi for very long, but in the short time that I've known her, it's just been really exciting to find somebody else who cares about human connection as much as, and maybe in the same way that I do. We have very different and yet maybe very similar backgrounds. Lakshmi was the first ever, really, like kind of its kind, director of workplace connection with WeWork, and before that, an event director at Match.com, and longtime career in hospitality industry. And I relate so much to your journey because it has this sort of non-traditional and totally consistent path that feels so aligned with mine, in that, like, I never knew service design existed as a career, nor did I really know that coaching was a thing. But all the choices I've made in my life, and when I look at yours, I think maybe this is true for you. All my choices have been driven by creating human connection. And so, as my fellow connection nerd, I've been really excited to talk to you about what this moment looks like for human connection, and maybe the cost we are all paying for being apart while finding opportunities to connect more and deeply. So Lakshmi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
My very first thought when I heard about social distancing was, oh no, what if we get used to this? What does that mean for our long-term cultural norms? What was your first thought as you heard about the actions that we were taking to protect ourselves from this disease?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I knew I was going to struggle with this because as someone who lives solo and lives in New York City, getting out and seeing people in person is a big part of how I connect. And I think I was also thinking about how, especially, I'm sure you can relate to this I feel like especially in the past decade, we have really been, as a culture, starting to reconcile what we handed over to technology. And there started to be this renewed appreciation for in-person gatherings and events, and people were really trying to prioritize that. And just as we were prioritizing it, it was suddenly the thing that we can't do anymore.
What sparks of hope are you seeing in the way we're reacting to social distancing?
Yeah, what I see right now is, I think we're going to get to the good stuff. I think right now we're in the experimentation phase, where we're actually confronting what works and what doesn't work for all of us. That I think you've heard me say this, that the first wave of solutions was just, okay, you can't have X anymore, but you can call, text, video chat. And we just sort of plugged that in as the solution to everything. And I think now we're starting to dive into some more of the nuances of that. And that was sort of like the first solution, was to reach for the nearest thing. But when those things start to show their own fragility, I think we're going to have a deeper conversation about, okay, now what is the right way to use all of these things? And they're not the answer to everything.
Yeah, instead of just accepting what's thrown at us. And I know you've been playing around with this idea that or that connection comes in many flavors,
Yeah.
and creating sort of a balanced palette of flavor. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I think like connection, I think we need some good sort of broad but specific definitions around it. And I think we can oftentimes confuse connection with networking or socializing or interaction, or this idea that it needs to be happening with somebody else. And I think some connection, requires other people, but a lot of connection for me is the way that I would define it in my work was just the act of being seen, heard, or feeling appreciated and acknowledged. And I think we think that that requires another person to be involved, but it doesn't always require that.
I never thought about like synchronicity as a connection point, but it is true. Like, I remember having this conversation about synchronicity with a friend and how much we had a shared sort of love and excitement around those things that feel just like magical. And it was in that moment of realization that we realized that we needed to be friends forever.
Right. No, absolutely.
And it was a deep, profound moment of connection that I will treasure always. And I remember still where that happened. And I believe that like the connection I feel to her all this time later comes back to that intense moment of, I feel like you feel about this thing that feels just sort of magical.
Yes. And to your point, like that can happen with another person. It can also happen when you read something, or it can happen when you see yourself reflected in art or in entertainment, right? These are all different ways of feeling connected.
Totally. Totally. And I think when you start to color it that way, Lakshmi, it starts to point to all the possibilities to create connection.
Yes.
And meaningful connection across a whole spectrum.
Right. Exactly. And also it brings, I think, gravitas to why people want to see diverse casts and diverse stories. Because when we don't do that, there's this whole group, this whole swath of the population that is not feeling connected to what they see on the screen or what they see in art or what they see in entertainment.
So I've been locked in my house. It sounds so
You
dramatic,
too?
right? For, I don't know, what are we at, like 4 or 5 weeks? I've lost count. I think it's Sunday. For a while with a bunch of people and a dog. And that has its own challenges and opportunities. You've been mostly in your apartment.
Yeah.
Physically with just yourself. What are you discovering?
I'm starting to understand my own behaviors and needs with the tools that are around me. So like I said, I know I don't really like this many people on screen. I start to feel like the fraying of the cohesion. I know that I need to pace myself. It's lovely to get texts from people. It's lovely to hear from your great aunt that never seemed to reach out to you before. But there's all this new stimulus to make up for what we didn't get outside. And so there's going to be a period where we're all trying to sort of sort through and filter that stimulus to figure out which of those actually do we need, and what are the new boundaries, and what are the new things, what's the new saying no, and what's the new saying yes. So I'm myself, like I think a lot of other people, trying to be mindful of those and start to answer those questions for myself.
Yeah, I love that. It sort of comes full circle to where you were before about being aware enough to choose.
Yes. Yes.
Instead of just going on autopilot and accepting things as they are.
Right. I mean, exactly. Because all of our social interactions before were probably, for many of us, largely default. Right. They just sort of appeared, and that this was the menu of items you had to choose from. Probably a combination of like a fundraiser, a dinner, drinks with friends, a movie. And when those aren't on the menu anymore, what is, and which of those is actually what are the things you actually want to go to? What are the things you want to work up to? What are the things you only want to do once in a while? And there's all of these sort of social questions that we probably had the answers to in the outside world that we need to answer for the inside world.
We're seeing so much that we missed before.
Yeah.
Just by the nature of the boundaries that are in place.
Yeah.
It's like there's freedom within framework, or however you want to put it. We've got these boundaries, and it's opening up all this possibility, which I find, again, if we're looking for sparks of hope, I find that really encouraging.
Yeah, you're hearing people look at their food differently, their laundry differently, their entertainment differently, with a probably, like what you pointed out, probably an acute sense of things they didn't notice before, and probably a newfound appreciation.
I want to come back to this concept that you've been working on around sort of finding your flavors of connection.
Mm-hmm.
What are some, you mentioned people want to be seen, heard, appreciated, and acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate to your menu idea?
Yeah, so I think the way that I had sort of described it was kind of comparing it to sort of like dietary guidelines, that mix of like proteins and starches and vegetables, and then, like whatever, like healthy fats, whatever the new recommendations are. But kind of understanding, like almost like what is, of all the things that you do, which of those truly feels the most restorative? And here's the thing about that is, when you ask people that question, they usually won't have the answer right away, but they will very often arrive at an answer once that question has been lodged. Like, because it's not something that most people have had to think about, right? So, because if you've only thought about connection as the time when you're with other people, when a new definition is kind of introduced, then you're sort of like looking at it again. And someone, might realize that the most restorative act of their week was going for a walk through Central Park, or a walk through an empty Times Square, or a walk through their, down their neighborhood street. And I always tell people, like, get really specific about it. Because there's, like, even in a walk, there's certain walks that are more powerful than others. It could be, this very particular combination of like cooking breakfast and like looking out the window and having the news on, right? Like we just sort of do these things, but if you kind of take a moment and really pause to be like, which one of those was actually really good? Because it could have been the 30-person virtual happy hour, or it might have actually been when you were folding laundry, or it might have been when you were cooking, this recipe that you'd never tried before. It could have been when you were cleaning out your shelf. So, and you may not have thought of those other activities as acts of connection. But again, if you go back to like our definition, those really can be and often are. And so kind of putting out your own menu of, these are all the moments when I felt really connected. These are the moments when I felt actually kind of disconnected. And you may realize that maybe the 30-person happy hour is not your thing, or maybe it is. And maybe being on FaceTime with your family all the time is restorative, or it's not. And just starting to draw awareness around those. And then from that, thinking of, okay, like how do I amplify the things that actually are like, oh my God, I think when I take a walk around Central Park when there are kids around is actually my best time walking, then trying to create more opportunities for that.
It's so much about paying attention to what it is about those moments.
Right.
So it's like, as you talked about walking through Central Park with the children, there are so many questions it uncovers. Is it about being outdoors? Is that where you seem to feel most alive and connected? Is it when you're hearing signs of joy? is it the
Right.
combination of the two and starting to notice those trends? But we can't notice those things without paying some attention.
Right. And it exactly. And it usually, from what I've noticed in my work, it actually happens in these like moments that we don't necessarily realize until we reflect on them. So like, and as we both know, like asking people questions about it helps them identify what was actually at the heart of that thing. So like I had a guy one time tell me that he actually experienced a lot of connection listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast. And I sort of like probed a little bit more, like, well, what is it about it? And it came down to this, like that for him, Tim was asking all the questions that he always wished he could ask. Mm-hmm. And so he actually felt kind of represented and seen in that, in the way that this particular interviewer operates. And so like identifying like, oh, it's not just that he thought it was a great podcast. It's like, there was actually something much more profound happening.
Totally. And it's also, I think it sounds like there is he's my people, right? Yeah. Here's someone else whose brain works in a way that feels complementary or similar to my own.
Yeah.
And it's sort of furthering what I would do if I were in that position.
Totally. And it could be just as connective if his response was, he asks the questions that I would never think of. Right. So whatever that is, kind of nailing down what is that connective fiber for you, for lack of a better term, and then trying to sort of see that, appreciate it, and then trying to multiply those opportunities.
I love that. I was doing some research this week about the newly declared public health epidemic around loneliness, mm-hmm. and how it's, I mean, of course, intrinsically linked to health outcomes. And the very young and the very old are both spiking increasingly over the last decade.
Yeah.
And just the cost to all of us of loneliness. And so it's like, I think we spend a lot of time as a society talking about how to be happier, how to be richer, how to be smarter. But maybe the more important question really is how to feel more connected.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think with the whole loneliness discussion, kind of really, again, drilling down like by what we mean by that, because you can be one of 8 siblings or you can be married and feel incredibly lonely.
Totally.
And just making sure that like we're talking about, like what is at the heart of that. Because I think when we hear loneliness, we think of like physical isolation, when actually it's so much broader than that.
Totally.
And so, yeah, again, like my one question around that, whenever I hear that, is like, well, how are you defining loneliness in whatever conversation you're having? Yeah.
I think importantly, in these studies, they're talking about self-reported loneliness, which,
right,
to your point, comes in so many flavors.
Right.
It's really easy for many of us to feel incredibly lonely in a room full of 10 or 100 people. Whereas I feel personally, 10 or 20 people make me feel really lonely. 1,000 make me feel incredibly connected in many cases.
Right. Yeah. And that's so important, because like you'll hear the people talk about loneliness and then their solution will be like, let's have a dinner party. And it's like, well, maybe that could be one thing, but maybe there's a whole other set of things that we need to be talking about.
Mm-hmm. And I love your sort of palette or plate analogy for this, because I think it's similar with food, right? We have in our society over time made food the one-stop shop for managing everything. Yeah. It's like, you want to celebrate, you eat. You want to feel comfort, you eat. You want you're lonely, eat. It's your birthday, eat. I mean, like everything. Go to the movies. There's eating around as a deep coded ritual for most of us. And so this, I think too, like spend time with one other person becomes sort of like the deep coded mission around connection. But there are so many different flavors of this. And if we understand our own palate, like I know I'm somebody who really likes umami flavors and really earthy. I mean, those were not words I knew for flavor.
Right. Right.
Just like I don't know all these different words and types of connection
Yes.
that people can form.
Right. Totally. And because if you talk to a lot of artists, they'll say they feel deeply connected, and they may not be around anybody. Right. They may be just totally immersed in their craft and don't feel that, but they are physically probably alone, but they don't necessarily talk about, I mean, some of them may, but they talk about feeling deeply connected to the world.
Right. And it's not about an individual or the type of conversation, but it's about the act of creation and the conversation that happens between sharing art with the world and what the world responds with,
right,
or even just with the universe.
Right.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And I think also just the loneliness conversation needs to sort of be put in like thoughtful historical context, because so much of our response to this is the result of people wanting to be more independent and wanting to give more autonomy to people, and more, it actually comes from a place of wanting to empower people. Right. So these might be some of like the sort of the collateral costs of all of these actually like really, really well-intentioned societal shifts.
There is also, I think, a luxury in our ability to tune in and understand ourselves.
Yes.
And to not just accept things as they are, but to your point, really notice what it is, what nutrients do we need to take in order to truly nourish our mind, body, and soul.
Right. Totally.
And I think, beginning with where do you feel seen, heard, appreciated, and acknowledged are probably the right 4 questions to frame that whole conversation. Because I think it's a bit cerebral to say, like, where do you feel connected? Because I just don't know if that word means the same thing to each of us. But you've got even more specific, I felt like, with those 4 verbs, and it made it really easy to just start thinking about, okay, when have I felt seen? And as you said, looking back.
Totally. Like, I think that the 7 o'clock applause is one of the most connected of my day, and I'm not around anyone.
I'm gonna cry just thinking.
It's enormously connective, and yet a lot of people are doing that in isolation. But it is the unison of it is I would say is highly, highly connective.
I think it's also, for me, the thing that I'm struck by every day is how close I feel to everyone who's far away from me. Right. And even though, I mean, far is relative, but these are people who are across the street or 4 stories above me, or like, I will not see their faces today. I don't even know where the sound is coming from.
I know.
I feel them. I know they're there because I can hear them. And I don't know. I find wildly reassuring, well beyond even the mission of the moment, right? Which is incredible and important. And I think it's feeding so many of our needs in many more ways than just the gratitude with which it was originally focused.
Absolutely. And just think about how this is also something that I look at a lot in terms of how, the seeds of disconnection, but we do very few things together anymore, right? We do things when we want to do them on our schedule, at our whim, including when we watch television, right? So it's very rare to even get people to be watching the same thing at the same time. You can watch the news when you want to, you can watch whatever Amazon or Netflix show when you want to, whether the show came out 10 years ago or it's the hot new thing. And so much of what we do is very much dictated by our own schedule. And so what's actually really beautiful about the 7 o'clock is that it's one of the few collective schedules that exists right now.
So there's like an agreement in certain cities. They stand outside and clap for compassion at 8 p.m. In New York City, we clap for compassion at 7. And we have made a citywide agreement that that moment is our moment to come together.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everyone kind of just falls in line and has embraced it. And I think that, it's just, and it's like a reminder of how we just don't really do things like that anymore.
No, that's such a good point. There's so much that we used to do on a schedule. And now, like, if you talk to consumers about their core value when selecting most products, flexibility and convenience are always going to be the very top drivers.
Right.
And if you can't deliver on flexibility and convenience, then you should go back and work on your product.
And there's so many benefits to flexibility and convenience, right? But it's like, I'm always asking, like, with all these things that we take for convenience, what's lost in that process? What do we give up?
Mm-hmm.
And we do give up things. And I think that actually also gets to like the heart of loneliness is
Totally.
we're all on our own schedule.
Right. You're so right. And I think it comes all the way back to what you were saying about events and shared experiences. There is agreement that must be made to attend a synchronous shared experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And back to this, like, that's why I think loneliness is actually, there's so many layers to how we got here. But think about, like, when you and I were growing up, there were 4 television shows that, kind of everybody watched. And they really were like, like, these were the shows that everybody watched. And there's so much to be said for diversity of content. Don't get me wrong. But it's very rare to be watching the same thing as somebody else right now. Right. You have to go seek those people out. And so, like, there's, yes, you get to watch what you want to watch when you want to watch it, but then you really don't have anyone to talk about it with necessarily, unless you actually kind of try and find that person.
Let's see, if I try to recap, and will you help me do this? Absolutely. We recap the takeaways from this. Part of it is to just freaking pay attention to ourselves and what helps us feel connected when we feel seen, heard, acknowledged, and appreciated.
Yes. And this should be a fun process. Like, this is like, this,
you must do this.
Yeah. Like, it is like, it's a serious, like, shift, but, it can be a really fun process to really think about, like, where actually am I getting, like, the good vibes from truly, and, like, what's at the heart of it.
I love to, like, we should or can even go about that process in an individualized way.
Yeah.
So, like, for me, somebody who is super verbal, it might be easier for me to do that by having a conversation with you.
Absolutely.
About those moments rather than trying to sit and stare at a wall and do it.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Or even write it. It really depends on who we are and how we process.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's about looking for those things and then looking for the patterns among those things. And then looking at them together, I think, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So if it's, with your plate idea in mind, it's not just all carbs all the time.
And maybe giving that has connected properties that you may have not noticed before.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. So that I can appreciate it with more acceptance.
Yeah. And then you can even figure out, like, well, how do I make this feel even more connected?
The show is called Live Up. What, from your life experience, would you say is one of, if not the most important thing to consider if we want to live up?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to the core of what I said when it comes to connection, is understanding, like, what works for you, what doesn't. Excuse me. And then I think being open to shifting and experimenting with that, and knowing that what worked in one situation may not work in another, and to not surrender to sort of copy paste the copy paste tendency.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, and that, that's something that I'm working on. I think you're working on it. We're all working on it. So
yeah. And to what you said before, it is a practice.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's not just, oh, this works for me, ta-da, fixed.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, yeah, just like being, like in all the work you do, just sort of being iterative about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we can get curious and stay curious.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for hanging out with me today.
Frances.
I want every excuse to hang out with you. So
I think we can create a lot of excuses with our time right now.
I think so too. Thank you again, and be well. We'll be connected. So grateful for you in my life.
Thank you. Likewise.